Satan, not a very popular subject. And I guess we're on a roll because last week we talked about dying, even a less popular subject. But if you've been with us, you know that we've been talking about the spiritual realm and that we are really spiritual entities living in a physical world. And in that, since we live in a spiritual realm, we have to deal with this topic of Satan. Now, we're going to find this morning that most people are in denial of Satan altogether. In fact, the only time you know there is a Satan is if someone's vomiting green goop and their head turns backwards in a movie and, oh, that's Satan. Well, he would like you to think that because he wants people to live in denial because he's a powerful adversary. And, you know, we see it all around us every day. It seems like there's not a week anymore that you don't see in the news about a shooting or some type of atrocity, some type of evil taken upon another person, whether it's a family member or someone in public. It's always there. And society doesn't have an explanation for why it exists, and we'll talk about that in this morning's lesson. But we know different, don't we? We know that we are spiritual beings living in a physical world. And because of that, we've already looked at these 3 points and we've asked God to open our eyes to the fact that there is a spiritual realm. And again, I'll show you this chart. There's a spiritual realm that's all-encompassing. And inside it, if it's a smaller realm, we call the physical. It's pales in comparison to what's going on in the spiritual. I don't care how many kings or people in authority or wars are waged on this little place called earth. What really is happening is in the spiritual realm, as we're going to see in this morning's lesson. We also saw that, no, I'm not a body that happens to have a spirit. It's actually the opposite, isn't it? We are spiritual beings living in a body. The real you and the real me has never been seen with the physical eye. We just see the vessel that carries around the you, the real you. And someday we're going to leave this body, this vehicle. It'll be set aside, and that's what death is. It's a separation. That's all it is. It's not when you cease to exist. It means it's when you are separated from your body and you move into the spiritual realm altogether. So we saw we all have an appointment with death, each one of us. Now, while we're living on this earth, there's a battle before us. And that's what I want to spend the next 2-3 weeks talking about. Because if we're not aware of that battle, we're powerless to engage in it, and much less will we ever overcome. But this spiritual battle, again, as we pointed out, is denied by most in the world. And because of that, they don't have an answer to the problems and the evil they see in the world. But those of us that are spiritual, we're going to open our eyes and we're going to engage confidently in this battle because we know that in Christ we can overcome all things. And so this first lesson we're just going to talk about this morning is there is a battle before us. There is a spiritual struggle with the forces of Satan and darkness. And that's all we want to see. Next week we want to talk about not who we fight, but what. There's 3 fronts to this battle. 3 areas where we wage warfare. And then we'll look later at how we fight in this battle because our weapons are not physical at all. But let's talk about the idea that we're in a spiritual battle. Jacob read for us Ephesians chapter 6, where Paul ends this wonderful, brilliantly written letter to the Ephesians by saying that he wants us to stand in the strength of the Lord's might. And we're going to do that by putting on the armor of God. And that's so in verse 11, we can stand firm against the schemes of Satan. And that's what we have to understand. There is an entity called Satan or the devil. And we're going to see, first of all, the first point, the world's in denial. And since they're in denial, they have no answer how to stand, how to deal with him, how to overcome him. because they don't acknowledge that he even exists. Then finally, we're going to look at the spiritual battle, how it's outlined in this short passage, verse 10 through 13. So let's look at the idea of the world is in denial. It's interesting, in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, we see that Paul writes, it says, the God of this world has blinded the minds of those who are unbelieving. Now, what happened then continues to happen now. The word blinded means your vision is obscured by the smoke that is in the air. The Eastern Oregon fires, it's just a terrible fire season. But was it Friday? The aircraft could not take off, that are dropping retardant and dropping water because the winds had stopped and all the smoke had settled and there was not good enough visibility. So until the winds came up and pushed the smoke away, they couldn't fly because they couldn't see. That's the same language that is used here spiritually. The fires of hell have been burning so long that it has clouded the vision of people spiritually, and they have no clue about what's really going on. They're blinded to it. They just see with their physical eyes, and their spiritual eyes remain closed. And that's what has happened throughout history, because Satan would want it to be that way. He said, well, when did it happen in the Western world? Because we used to be a religious Christian people. Well, often it's attributed to the Enlightenment. And of course, Friedrich Nietzsche, in his writings commenting on the attitude culture that day, said, God is dead. He says, God remains dead. He said, we killed him. Now, it's interesting when PBS did a discussion about the presence of evil and how we can deal with it. Is there any type of spiritual forces behind it? The speaker, the narrator there at the time said, when Friedrich Nietzsche pronounced that God is dead, he said the devil was mortally wounded as well. Because if you dismiss God in the spiritual, on the same hand, don't you dismiss the forces of evil spiritually? So in the Western mindset, they killed God and they killed Satan as well. He goes on to say that Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, he argued and convinced people sin is only a mental illness. It's not a spiritual malady. There's no individual responsibility. You just got a mental issue you have to deal with. And so he says Satan himself has been reduced to a figment of your imagination. Of course, they would have you believe, such men as Dawkins, that God is someone like the tooth fairy. It's something you tell your kids about, which is not true. It's a lie. Well, if God is a lie, the Western world has convinced themselves, being blinded, that Satan is unreal as well. Now, that gives you license to do anything, doesn't it? If there is no God who you're accountable to, and there's no evil influence in your life, you're free to do whatever you want without moral judgment or any type of restriction. And that's pretty much describes the Western world. So when you look at it, the mindset of our Western society is naturalism. And basically that means everything can be explained scientifically. That's why it's so important that you accept that a Big Bang started the universe, not God. It's so important in their minds that you accept evolution and not being created in God's divine image. Because then we reduce everyone just to a biological mass. There's no morality, and science is the answer to everything. And that's what they believe. And everything has a natural cause. And because of that, anything that you point to, crime, greed, covetousness, social injustice, and pollution, whatever it is, murder, it all has a physical cause because there is no spiritual. Remember that, right? So they have to look to a physical cause. And so calling something evil, which they don't use that word, implies there's a system of morality. And if you have system of morality, then you have absolutes. You can say someone, you shouldn't do this, you should do that. And since they don't want to be held to a higher standard, because there is no God, then we cannot have any value system at all. Everyone's going to be free to do what they want. And so how do you explain when something apparently looks evil happens? We're near the anniversary of the shooting in Las Vegas, the largest mass shooting in recent history. 58 people were murdered. And they came out they ended the investigation this week. It was on the news. And I was like, what was the motive? Why did he do it? And after all the many thousands of hours of investigative work, they could not come up with a motive. No idea why he did it. And so I ask, how do you explain evil if you reject the spiritual realm? Everything has to have a physical cause. Well, they quickly turned to medical terms. Well, you lived in a dysfunctional family. Maybe you just have a mental illness or a predisposition genetically to this type of lifestyle. Or you were socially maladjusted, and it was probably because of poor, dysfunctional educational system. See, everything has to be explained away because you're not responsible for what you did. Actually, you're a victim. And that's how they speak. Now, it's interesting. Alcohol is called a disease, isn't it? Alcoholism, excuse me. Now we're here to argue the merits of that, but the most effective plan to treat alcoholism is the 12-step program, and in that program you have to accept 2 or 3 key things. One, you have no power over yourself, and you have to appeal to a higher power to find deliverance. It appeals to the spiritual because the physical world has no answer to that disease. And so you look at it, that's where the natural world is. And it goes on, he says, any problem you see can't be a spiritual issue. And so if we just put our minds to it, we'll fix it somehow. Just give us enough time. Now, science is great when dealing with medical issues, cancer, heart transplants. It's just amazing what they can even do there. In fact, it's almost where hearts used to be a major thing, but now it's almost so commonplace that it happens all the time. We can figure it out and fix it. But have things been getting better in the world when it comes to things of evil or the atrocities that people commit? And so that's where the world is. Nothing's changed. It's always been this way. Jesus said this in Matthew 13, the hardest people become dull with their ears. They scarcely hear. They've closed their eyes. And he says it's because they don't want to open them so they can be healed. They don't want to. It's because they have been won over by that spiritual force called Satan, who lives just to seek, to kill, and to destroy. And if we're not willing to acknowledge that he even exists, it's impossible for us to engage in him in a spiritual warfare. It's impossible to resist that which we don't acknowledge even exists. And so we will be defeated. And that's where the world is. They're blinded and they're in denial. It's interesting. Zechariah said the same thing in the Old Testament. They refuse to pay attention. Refuse. See, it's not because they can't believe, it's they won't. The second point I want to point out is it's just as important. When you have this mindset of denial, there's no right or wrong. Then you are put in the enviable position of trying to explain why there is evil, which we don't even use that word, that exists in the world. And then second of all, how are you going to deal with it? And how are you going to resolve it? Now, it's interesting in World War II, when evil existed in Europe, people were asking the United States to be involved. President Roosevelt referred to the isolationists in America. They polled 94% of America are crustaceans possessing a nerve cord but no brain. That's strong language. he realized it wasn't a matter of if we were going to be involved in war. He just knew it was a matter of when. He spoke of them that deluded themselves into believing that America could be safe and by being aloof, that they just didn't have brains to think. They would argue that the military was ill-equipped to enter the war, which was true. They would argue that the economy couldn't stand the drain of a military buildup. And they also believed the Atlantic Ocean would protect them from the evil that existed on the other side, the German war machine. Now we know this denial came to a quick and sudden end on December 7th in 1941. And that's when Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese. And instantly, that 94% majority of isolations just disappeared. Congress reversed their vote of neutrality, and they opted to fight back on both fronts. See, if you remain in denial, you will never engage. And that's where the world is spiritually. When they deny the presence, first of all, of God, and then also of Satan. And so when we consider this is so important. There was a writer who wrote a book. His name is Andrew DeBlanco, and his book was written, The Death of Satan. And he addresses this problem that's facing our culture where we can't explain why evil exists, especially since we can't use the word. He says a gulf has opened in our culture between the visibility of evil and the intellectual resources available for coping with it. He's saying if we can't accept there is evil and we don't have the vocabulary to talk about it because everything has to be scientifically explained, we're in an impasse. We can't address the problems that are before us. He goes on to say in his book, the repertoire of evil has never been richer. I mean, it's all around us. You see it. But our responses are so weak. We have no language connecting our inner lives with the horrors that pass before us. And you say, well, what do you mean? When he writes this book, he says, here is my motivation for writing it. If the conviction is that evil, let me read the whole thing. My driving motive in writing this book has been the conviction that if evil, with all the complexity that Augustine attributed to it, escapes the reach of our imagination, evil, will establish dominion over all. What is he saying? That if we don't acknowledge it and address it, it will master us because we will not even engage. The world has no answer for the problems go on. Tim Keller gives 4 points to the person that says, I can't believe in Satan. Well, you live a simplistic lifestyle. Simplistic is because how are you going to explain what's really going on? And how come people do things that are just, when you look at it, the only answer is evil. They're evil people. And we have a hard time attributing it because we want to say, oh, they were maybe abused in their childhood. Maybe they were abandoned. Now, there are things that cause and set people up, but how I respond to them will determine what kind of heart I have. And if they were abused and abandoned as a child, that was evil perpetuated against them. That started this whole cycle. But if we're in denial, we can't even talk about that. We're looking for just some physical cause, and the world has no answer if they're in denial. Also, you're culturally narrow-minded if you're not willing to accept the presence of Satan. So what? There's something about America. We think we're so enlightened that we, reversing centuries of tradition that says marriage is between a man and a woman, and reversing the attitudes of the majority of the world, we in our narrow-minded viewpoint, we are so enlightened, we decided that marriage can be between same sexes. And that's the loving thing to do. And the same is true when it comes to Satan. Most of the world believes in demonic forces. Most of the world will attribute evil to the spiritual battle that goes on. But yet, in the Western world, we have grown up and dismissed such fanciful thoughts. It's culturally narrow-minded, like we're the brightest people in the world. And it's also inconsistent. If most of the people in America believe in a God, which they do, a benevolent, loving, sacrificial person that will do anything to help you, isn't that the Western view of God? How come then we could not believe in the opposite of that benevolent, rescuing God that's a God of righteousness and justice? How come we can't have the opposite, a spiritual entity that's out there to destroy and to inflict harm and evil? See, it's almost impossible to speak of one without acknowledging the other. God himself says, who loves righteousness, I hate sin. See, sin isn't just a mental condition, it's a choice. Now, Satan might have a role in causing us to sin, but it does take place in the spiritual realm. Finally, it leaves us in the dark. If you're not willing to acknowledge that there is a spiritual realm with a spiritual entity that is out to destroy everything that is good, called Satan, you're left in the dark how to manage your own life, how to answer these big questions, where does this evil come from, and how to deal with it and overcome it in your own life. C.S. Lewis, we like to quote him, he was quite a thinker, even though he wasn't inspired. He said in his book, The Screw Tape Letters, there are two equal and opposite errors into which our race, mankind, can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. So what he says is, what people will do, first of all, is, I don't want to go there because that's scary, so I'll deny they exist altogether. Now, the other is the opposite. They blame Satan in the demonic world for everything. And so they surrender. And you hear people say that in the past, I couldn't help myself. The devil made me do it. So anytime someone's mad or something that happens, it's Satan's fault. You know, they're being led by Satan. Everything is Satan. And so that's equally just as wrong as denial itself. In fact, it's more nuanced than that. When people get depressed, are there several reasons why a person can be depressed? It could be a medical issue, couldn't it? Just a biological, physical problem, maybe hormones out of balance. It could be because of trauma in their life, severe loss. And that depression is just temporary. The depression could be because of wrongs they have suffered by someone else. No sin of their own, but the sin of someone else. Their depression or soulness could be because of wrongs they have committed and they haven't dealt with them. Now that is in the spiritual realm, isn't it? So when you ask, why is so-and-so depressed? You just say, that's Satan. Or they just need to get spiritually connected or whatever. That's too simplistic of an answer, isn't it? Anger. The anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. Anger is a spiritual issue. Does anger only find its roots in Satan in the spiritual realm? Not necessarily. Sometimes anger is justified. When you have suffered some injustice by someone else, you have a right to be angry. God was angry at times. But Paul writes in his letter to the Ephesians, says, be ye angry and sin not, and do not let the sun go down on your wrath, and do not give the devil an opportunity. See, even when there is a reason for me to be angry, if I allow it to persist in my life and don't deal with it correctly, I give Satan a foothold in my life. And anger leads to bitterness, and that's the root of division. It'll destroy a person spiritually, internally. So anger, it's not all because of the devil, but it is a spiritual issue. And I just want to use that to explain what we're dealing with here. And so C.S. Lewis says, don't deny it. You say, when someone's upset, just get over it. That's too simplistic. But don't blame everything on Satan either, because that's going to extreme in relieving yourself of individual responsibility. So what's the truth? Well, it's always in the middle, isn't it? Let's go back to what Paul said in Ephesians chapter 6. Read with me there in verse 11. Put on the full armor of God, that you may be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the full armor of God, that you may be able to resist in the evil day. And having done everything, stand firm. See, Paul begins this discussion with the word stand, and he ends it with it standing firm. It's all about engaging in this spiritual warfare that's ever before us so that we can stand. I want to point out 5 S words. The first word is a stand. The last word is stand as well. But let's look at the ones in between. But first of all, the word stand firm. That demands you and I to be individually engaged. You cannot stand on the sideline and be an isolationist. We have to stand against the evil powers of the spiritual realm. We can't just think, well, no, that's for you to engage in, and I don't have. No, if you take that attitude and stand on the sidelines, you will be overcome. Paul says this is something we all have to be involved in. This battle is all ours. It's personally, and sometimes it's collectively. Satan attacks us as a group, and he attacks your marriage, and he attacks your family, and attacks you personally. We'll talk about that next week, the 3 fronts in which this war is engaged. But you have to be involved. Notice he says that you can resist the schemes of Satan, the schemes of the devil. That word schemes literally means methods. It's where the Greek word which we get methods from. He has methods that he uses. He's got these tactics that most people are unaware of, and we have to talk about them. And it's interesting when he says the methods of the devil, that word devil is diabolos, and we get the English word diabolic. Oh yeah, I recognize that. But you have to understand, this is not a noun here, it's a verb. His diabolic scheming. He is a liar and a cheat, and he's been that way from the beginning. Jesus acknowledged that in John chapter 12 and verse 44, or John chapter 8. Anytime he says something and does something, it's a fraud, it's deceitful. And Paul says, I want you to resist his schemes. And if you don't understand, you can't trust anything he says or does, you're going to be overcome. So we got to get our awareness elevated. How does Satan work? How does he infiltrate my life personally? Is my struggle sexually a matter just simply of the flesh, or is this a spiritual battle? Is my problems in my marriage, is that just because of cause and effect, or Satan seeking to destroy this most perfect, intimate relationship that God ordained from the beginning? When I have problems with my brother and sister in the church and I don't even want to talk to them, is that because I just have a sense of justice, or is Satan lying to me and trying to destroy this church from the inside out? See, everything that you've been told is a lie from Satan. Everything you've been taught by society, the world, that, oh, we can fix it physically, it's deceitful. We have to open our eyes and understand it's a real spiritual battle. We have to get involved and understand the schemes that he uses. Now, the word struggle is very interesting. He said, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of wickedness. Isn't that what it says? First point I want you to see. When he says it's not against flesh and blood, he's not saying that never does flesh and blood fight against us. He's not saying that. He's saying, more importantly, this is a not but clause, More importantly, our battle is waged in the spiritual realm. Does Satan use physical humans to battle for him? 2 Corinthians 11, we can read that later. Yes, we're not surprised that servants disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. They're men and women. He will use people, and people will do us harm. But the chief enemy is who? Satan. The war is not battled with physical weapons, but it's waged in the spiritual realm. That's why he says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood. So please, do not get angry at your brother for what they fail to do because they're not perfect enough as a Christian, or they do something against you. Satan wants you to fight each other, doesn't he? Who's the real enemy? It's Satan himself and all his demonic powers. There's nothing more than he would wish to do is divide one against the other. He said, well, what about people in the world that are evil? No, Jesus himself, he said, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Sometimes they know what they're doing, but have this heart of Jesus. I'm going to forgive them because the real battle's against who? It's Satan. It's in the spiritual. And don't become a pawn of Satan because he uses people that have anger and bitterness and unforgiveness in their heart. You are the people that he can use when you have that. Second of all, the word struggle. There's a lot of ways to fight. You can fight with weapons, guns, bombs. In their days, it was swords and arrows. This word fight is only used, I think, only here in the whole New Testament. It's the word pele, and it means hand-to-hand combat. It's the idea of wrestling, and it's wrestling till you put your opponent down on the ground, and in submission, you have your arm and hand against his throat. This is individual, intimate, close, hand-to-hand combat. And that's the word he chooses to use when he talks about our spiritual struggle. It's individual, and it's a fight to the end. And until he's overcome, you cannot quit fighting. And then fourthly, he says it's against the spiritual forces. There is evil in the world. We have to acknowledge, James will read about him later, he says, resist Satan, he'll turn and flee. But we have to learn how to resist him. The battle is not waged in the physical, it's in the spiritual. So we're going to have to talk about spiritual disciplines that we're going to have to employ in our life to ward off Satan. Things we can do individually and collectively, because if we don't engage in them, we're going to be overcome. That's where the battle is. And when the last thing is mentioned, it's another S word, stand against the schemes, struggle to the end, and don't ever give up, because there are spiritual forces that you can't fight physically. And if you've done everything that Paul asked you to do, put on the full armor of God, you will what? Stand. There's victory in Jesus Christ. And that's why we're here. Not just to meagerly get through this life as pawns, but to be overcomers that have victory someday in heaven. Well, that's our lesson. That's where we're going. It's a real battle. Come back and we'll talk about it more. But if you're with us, you realize, man, I just need to get enlisted in the army. I want to stand up for Jesus. Well, it's real simple. He's calling you. He's calling you by his gospel, where he's asked you to understand that he is the Son of God. He came to this earth to die for your sins so he could go into Satan and defeat the grave and defeat Satan and procure forgiveness for anyone that would come to him. If you're willing to come to Christ and bow the knee before him and say, I'll follow you wherever you go, he asks you then to be baptized with him in water for the forgiveness of your sins, and he will raise you up in his family, write your name in the book of life. You'll be part of his kingdom, his family. It's really just that simple. And then we can work together as we walk towards heaven as spiritual people on this world. If we can help you, won't you come as we stand and sing this song on Jordan's banks?